Hello YouTube vintage stereo collectors and restorers. I haven't made a video for a few days. Shortly after my last video on the boring power switch, I succumbed to one of these viruses that's going around. I went from feeling great, well, great for my age, to, well, I think I'm going to spend the next few days on the couch. I didn't do too much. I got my voice back today. My nose isn't running as much, so I'm getting better, but anyway, to anybody that's suffered one of these cold flus going around, and I usually don't get much of this stuff, or at least it doesn't take me down too much. I'm able to work through it. But anyway, enough of that. I was able to replace 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 capacitors in 3 days. That's kind of the way I was working. There's not many caps in this Luxman L210. So I decided I'm going to recap it mainly because it's these blue capacitors. These blue Rubicons. In this era, early 80s, there were a lot of them in Yamahas as well. And over time, they don't seem to have stood up as well. And it's not that the unit was dead or didn't work. It just degrades the sound. And I have to admit, so far, I love the way this baby sounds. It is dead quiet. In fact, you turn it on, no thump, no hiss. It's like, is this actually on? You got headphones, is it actually on? You turn the volume way up and you start to hear a little bit of hiss. That's really good. That's what I'm going to leave the original transistors in here. They look to be all stock. But I am recapping it just because of that. Just show you the other side of it here. What I actually wanted to talk about was Luxman. Yeah, so I found there's one set of transistors that's not original, but they are a good match. They're actually a little higher current handling, so that doesn't matter. But I was able to set the bias very easily. 15 millivolts at idle, no problem, and it's stable. Even with the old controls, if it's not stable, I'll replace them. I just want to talk about my history with Luxman. So my history with Luxman goes to a store that I worked at in 84 and 85 that sold, well, they were one of the bigger stores in town, and they did home stereo, they did car stereo, they did cell phones. They kind of did a bit of everything. They did car alarms. And we had, at the peak, I was figuring 6 or 7 techs just on cars. But I was there in 84 when Luxman was merged with Alpine. And some people were coming into the store and saying, well, I don't want any of the new product made by Alpine. There's a very loyal following on Luxman. So, for instance, this series here, the L210, came in 1981. That's the earliest it shows up in product literature. Somebody asked me in a question on the last video about the L1 through L5. Those came just a little bit later, but they're still a Luxman product. So this was a Luxman engineered product. And I remember at the time driving down to, they actually put a thing on in Toronto. There's an Alpine, there's a building in Mississauga. It was like it was the wholesalers for Alpine Canada. And they had a presentation, put on great food, that kind of thing. And I was listening to them, and this is basically what I remember them telling me, that, well, Luxman products were already filled with Alpine parts. And this is one thing I've noticed. So, in all the years I've done electronics, in Japanese stereo equipment, so much of the switch gear, for instance, tuning caps, that kind of stuff, in the analog electronics, which is the stuff we love, right, is Alps. They said, that doesn't change. Luxman was an American company established in 1925, blah, 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 blah. And over the years, they developed products that were slightly, I would say, more towards the connoisseur end of things. There are less of these sold, and I believe that as each series came in, and this is what they were trying to tell us, although there's some cost cutting and some simplification of electronics, they're retaining the same build quality and the same sound. And at the time, I thought that was true. And I remember the stuff, one of my jobs when we weren't busy was unpacking components, setting them up on the shelf, running them through the switcher, so you could switch them with different speakers, and dedicating a turntable to each one. We didn't switch turntables because of the noise problem. And so I remember, like, these were in production about 5-6 years. And by far, these sort of had a smooth, jazzy type of sound. And the L1 through L5 had that same sound. The CO1, the MO2, the separates had the same sound. And the store manager had this idea of doing something sort of unique, because we didn't have a lot of competition. There weren't many Luxman dealers. So they brought in Mirage loudspeakers, which were Canadian built. Later became Energy. They built Energy speakers for the UK brand. And we had these Luxman L210 or Luxman L410, which was the 80-watt version, with a pair of Mirage 750s, which was a two-way speaker, and a very nice sounding two-way speaker. And this wasn't a rock system, really. This was a system, and we had several people that came in that were more on the classical jazz side of stuff. And here's what I figured out over the years. My voice is going to start to go. I can just tell. These here have a quiet sound to them, and tremendous dynamic range. Doesn't matter what the wattage is, it's 45 per channel. But at the time, when CD players were coming out, and there's quite a bit of dynamic range headroom in those recordings, it was a good match to have a Luxman CD player, Luxman amp, and those Mirage speakers. There are certain things with quiet music, like classical music. These tended to be able to go from quiet to peak without any distortion, and just, okay, this is what I was thinking about. This is what compares it. Do you remember the first time, if you're an old guy like me, you saw a Sony Trinitron color TV? And I remember seeing one for the first time. It would have been about like 1970, maybe 71. Because I lived in an electro town, very few people bought those, but somebody had a Sony TV, and guess who it was? It was somebody from Electro Home. They had got it as something. They were looking at the competition. Here's what I remember about those Sony Trinitrons. The black in those tubes. You were sitting in a room and it went to a completely dark scene or between stations. The screen went completely black, pitch black. There's such this wonderful contrast in them. It was able to reproduce from no light to full light, just wonderfully, with very few aberrations or linearity problems. Okay, TV talk. Well, that's what I felt about these amps. And so any of those series, any of the champagne or silver Luxmans are basically Luxman designs. I'm talking about the vintage ones. So in '84, when Alps took over, they really tried to keep the build quality up. They were more expensive. They didn't go for entry market stuff. Well, I'm not kidding you. 2 years later, they started to bring some cheap stuff out with a black plastic faceplate. Or actually it was plastic with like almost a metal bent over it. And one of the ones I remember that came in, first one, was the LV101, their entry-level amp. This was an entry-level amp. No comparison. It was different electronics. It was more like a Techniques. Nothing wrong with that, but it was the victim of cost cutting. Now, of course, Luxman is sort of a premium boutique brand, and they only build expensive stuff. Back then, there was this race for lower prices. But the Japanese yen was going up. People wanted a higher standard of living over there, most understandably, so they had a cost cut. But now, they only build products for people that really want high-end stuff. I've actually listened to a couple of new Luxman products. Two things. One, they are freaking heavy. Heavy, like 35 pounders. I forgot the one that come back to me. And they also have that black curtain, black velvety curtain where the sound appears from. Fantastic soundstage. They went back to that. So I'm about to lose my voice, so I'm just going to leave it there. And once this is running and stuff, I'm going to talk a little more about it. No big issues with it. Fix those up. There's a little bit of crackling on the phono preamp. There's some bad solder in this area. Anyway, thanks for watching and listening.